Melinda Laituri. I'm the principal investigator on the C2M2 program project. I'll use that shorthand now, C2M2, throughout the morning because saying Cities COVID Mitigation and Mapping program is kind of a mouthful. With that, I'd like to just again remind you about ways to communicate. Please use the chat to share your name and location. Any projects that you want to highlight that are COVID related, you could also put in the chat. A reminder that as we have the panelists and the keynote address, there's a little Q&A button that's down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You should be able to click on and be able to put the questions there. We'll be tracking those for you to be able to address those as we go forward. We also opened up the Q&A so that you can see everyone's questions as well as you can make comments on the questions there. I also wanted to introduce Jungwon Kim. He is our postdoc on the project at Harvard University. He's helped with so much of the project itself and as well as with all the technical issues and things we've been dealing with the webinar. And Dr. Wendy Guan, who is from the Center for Geographic Analysis at Harvard University, and being able to help us with this environment here as well and facilitating a lot of the student research projects that we've been working on. I think that's everything that I need to say for welcoming remarks. And with that, I'll go ahead and get started. Jungwon, if we could have the next slide. Thanks. So this is the third day of our conference. And on day one, we looked at migration, mobility, and tourism. On day two, we looked at livelihoods in the economy, really thinking about access to basic services. And then on day three, now we're focusing on gender. And if you've participated in the last 2 days, a thread that's been presented through the number of our lightning talks has been looking at crime and domestic violence. So today our focus on gender and related societal issues, I think, is quite appropriate for us to be considering things. Just a little bit of background about where this project came from. The C2M2 program is built on partnerships, collaboration, and networking. This is foundational to this issue of sustainability. How do we make these kinds of programs continue? And what do we do to facilitate next steps? I think this is really important for us to think about in this setting that we have with so many people being able to participate. The pandemic provided an opportunity for us to build on an existing network of expertise that was developed by the Department of State Secondary Cities Project. So I was the principal investigator on the Secondary Cities program, which was a field-based initiative to map secondary cities for resiliency, human security, and emergency preparedness. And this initiative established 3 regional hubs, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And we've been highlighting these hubs throughout the last couple days, and we'll highlight again the hubs today as well. So we have Asia, where we had presentations from our Asia hub and our colleague Nama, who presented from Kathmandu Living Labs, and also have had a series of lightning talks from our partner projects there. We've had same thing with our Africa hub, and Gaston from our partnership with starting with secondary cities in Cameroon, where we were able to begin to really assess some of the issues with secondary cities in Africa. And then Latin America, where we'll highlight our colleague, Carlos Mena, and he will be on our panel today. So these regional hubs were key to be able to quickly launch the mapgive Cities COVID Mitigation Mapping program. That's been so important for being able to assess these things and bring people together from around the world. I say collaboration is very important and partnerships, and you can see at the bottom of the slide the number of entities who are also important and critical to this program, from the American Association of Geographers to the National Science Foundation, Spatiotemporal Center, to Harvard University and the Center for Geographic Analysis. And then also, obviously this is sponsored by the US Department of State. So in looking at these set of issues, as we've learned from the pandemic, I also want to just make a comment that with respect to this symposium that we've had, we've been tracking some of the metrics from this, and we've had people from 53 different countries participate. And this just, I think, indicates the global scope of the pandemic, as well as the level of interest in terms of people coming together who want to have this discussion. And so we've learned how important these issues are, and that we need to examine them in an interrelated fashion because they're so challenging to address. On the first day, our colleague Nama pointed out that the need to bring science and society together is essential. One of our colleagues, Dr. Richardson, during one of the panel sessions, highlighted the tensions between saving lives and saving livelihoods. Our keynote on the first day, Lars Peter Nissen, talked about how we have challenges with respect to the framework that we set and how we ask these questions, and that we may have to ask these questions differently. And this was echoed by the keynote on the second day by Dr. Francis Cody, who discussed the role of informal economies and vulnerable populations, but also highlighted the resilience that these different communities provide and our way to be thinking about the lessons we can learn from them and how best we can start to move forward and think about these next steps. So I think we have a map here, don't we, Jean-Juan? Can we go to the next slide? Oh, thank you. So this shows the scope of the Cities COVID Mitigation Mapping program. 12 cities throughout the world. Again, these different regional hubs that have been highlighted throughout the week, whether we're in Asia, in Africa, or Latin America. And again, some of these cities are cities that we worked with in the Secondary Cities Project. And so Kathmandu was critical to that. Pemba was an existing project that we had, as well as looking at issues related to looking at Cusco in Latin America. All of these areas have been so important to understand how we can tease out the details of the pandemic. So the pandemic has revealed the precariousness of those most vulnerable in our society. It's also exposed the pervasiveness of inequity around the world. And so I think that's, again, also demonstrates these common issues that we're finding that can bring us together to think about innovative, integrated solutions that we're going to have for this that will need to be long-term. They're not going to be quick fixes. There are things to have to build community, to build the dialogue, build the ways we can talk together, be able to identify these next steps that are going to be so important for our society and for the next stages. And so before we get started with our panelists, just again, recognizing that we know that the pandemic itself will exacerbate existing inequalities, inequities, and disparities around the world, that we need to understand how best to address these second-order impacts, that people will also be exposed to differentially, but also how we can build on those success stories that we've had. I think we're learning important things in this virtual environment that we can facilitate potential solutions. How we can begin to mitigate second-order impacts will be providing, require a better way of understanding how best to connect the different stories that are being told, the kinds of data that we will need to collect, and that it will be different than we've ever really thought about before. The story of what's in a number becomes so critical because numbers tell important stories about the haves and the have-nots around the world. So this is something that spans across multiple kinds of scales, across time, across space, across people to develop these solutions. So with that, it's a shorter introduction than we've had in the past couple of days. I'm going to move forward with kicking off the panel session. And our panel session today, again, the focus is looking at these issues of gender. We have a rich array of presenters this morning. I'll remind you that you have about 8 minutes to give your your presentation. I'll be tracking you, and I'll pop on at about a minute before you should close and just give you a reminder. We do have time after each presentation for a short period of, you can go back to the, John Juan, if you can go back, thank you. We do have time for a short discussion or some questions after the each presenter, but then I'll open it up for a general discussion at the end of the panel session. So with that, I will introduce our first panelist, Kevin Nelson. Kevin Nelson is the Urban Governance Lead for the Governance and Financing Self-Reliance team within the Bureau of Development, Democracy, and Innovation at USAID. In this role, he also chairs the Urban Expert Working Group. He leads efforts to support the new urban agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. He represents USAID as a member of Cities Alliance. So in looking at this issue of urbanization and the critical role of urbanization in this question of the pandemic, I think we have an important expert that will be presenting to us today. Kevin's talk is entitled Reclaiming Their Mark, Women's Empowerment in Civic Spaces During the Time of COVID. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Kevin.
Great, thank you very much, Melinda. I appreciate all the organizers coming together for this very important panel and discussion and symposium. I will share my screen to, let's see. To get us started. Oops. All right. Everyone can see that? All right, so within the 8 minutes I have, I just want to go over a couple organizing principles. First and foremost, looking at the lens that we have today, specifically in terms of the impacts of COVID, the idea about secondary cities, the panel itself focused on gender, and then looking at mapping and spatial development. Those things I wanted to highlight over the course of the next few minutes, some of the ways that USAID has been thinking about the nexus of each of those issues. So I'm going to just spend a minute or two talking about the broad framing that we have at the U.S. Agency for International Development about gender and how that has permeated across the variety of things that we do within the agency related to the topic at hand. And then take a few minutes to talk about a couple specific examples by which those lenses that that we've laid out in terms of impacts of COVID, looking at secondary cities and gender. And so as was described, as the urban governance lead, I kind of oversee the work of the agency focused on urbanization. So USAID over many years has kind of toggled back and forth between a very specific and deliberate focus on urbanization and kind of pulling back. And right now we're in a mode, I believe, where we really recognize the impacts of urbanization, but it's still taking us a little bit of time to get that up to the leadership level in terms of how wide and deep that focus should be. So specifically with that, I want to talk about kind of naturally the first order frame in terms of COVID. I know that we've talked about this in the symposium already, but what we've noted is back when the pandemic hit, we had a window last spring and summer where resources were being reallocated to address all issues for COVID-19. And in positioning, trying to ensure that we looked at the impact of cities, we had opportunities to message that and create ways so that money that was being spent for, say, global health, which was where the lion's share of our resources were going, that it had an urban focus to it. We were successful to some degree in that regard, but we did not build out a lot of specific or targeted urban programs focused specifically on COVID. But what we'd found is our portfolio, which had a wide range of impacts, a wide range of issues that we were covering. Yes, COVID made adjustments and changes, relevant for those things. And I'll talk about those specifically. But first and foremost, in terms of this discussion about gender, I want to just take a little bit of time to focus on, the current framing that we have in the agency, and this kind of borrowing from the previous administration over to the current one in terms of challenges and opportunities for urban women's economic empowerment. So I think that bridges the ways that we've been thinking about how any kind of programming that has a gender lens as well as an urban lens focuses on where can we advance economic empowerment for women. And so many of the three projects that I'll focus on we'll talk specifically about that. And so that particular framing looks at three particular issues. Women prospering in the workforce, so advancing those workforce development and vocational training skills, as well as the training that's necessary to secure quality jobs. Second, women succeeding as entrepreneurs, so promoting women's entrepreneurship and having access to capital, markets, technical assistance, and networks, and being able to work specifically and being enabled in the economy. So kind of pulling apart some of those constraints that women in particular face in terms of legal, regulatory, and other factors. So as a large scale frame that works both in urban and non-urban settings, this is where most of the gender work that we're trying to move forward with in an urban standpoint, as well as gender work around the agency. These are the things that we're trying to advance. So any investment in terms of empowerment, specifically on a gender scale, women, girls, focuses on these particular things, which I think is important to understand that the way that we have been addressing, meaning USAID, that we've been addressing, gender opportunities, it has come with investing in the areas that we have been already putting resources to. So the next phase, just kind of talking specifically about three particular topics or three particular case studies. One in Tunisia. This is a project that we have with the Cities Alliance focused on women's empowerment in urban centers. So looking at public open space and focusing on civic participation, looking at women's abilities to make use of that public space and being an active participant in in designing that space and programming it. The COVID impact certainly had been about, this project was supposed to kick off in December 2019, and because of many issues that we had come across, we needed to refocus that those efforts. And now there was in December of 2020 there was a kickoff within the Mayor of Tunis, focusing on that kind of empowerment. And the mission director, looked at, how human rights and the empowerment of women were critical to thinking about how women can be, instrumental in this work. Next, in Honduras, we worked with 89 different municipalities and 6 departments to address the socioeconomic challenges related to food security, climate vulnerability, and gender disparity, and looking specifically at issues related to combating violence. And the program there, in terms of COVID had an impact in terms of really trying to get us to understand what were those shocks and stressors, and what were those vulnerabilities that were new or more emerging in terms of the work there, and specifically understanding ways that women could have that greater role. And that project too, the local governance project needed it needed an extension of its work as well due to the COVID impacts. And third, just to kind of wrap up, in Tanzania, this is a project focused specifically on land titles and focusing on land rights. And the land titling, looking at this more focused on villages, but I think there's a lot of applicability in urban centers as well in terms of the role of female households to not only achieve that land title, but then use it in a way that can provide and bring forward additional opportunities. And so with that, the focus that we had here was specifically on using our MAST technology. So mapping, so to do some geospatial mapping of
one more minute, Kevin.
Sure thing. Of those properties, and in doing so, we'd found that that women in those areas, or in those villages, as well as what we're finding is applicability of using the MAST program, this geospatial mapping, had led to various decreases in boundary disputes, had led to greater assurances of land possession, and using that. And so with regard to COVID, I mean, I think the issues have been, again, there are vulnerabilities there in terms of kind of assessing that data, vulnerabilities about being able to bring forth some of the applications to other areas, because this was not meant to be a singular effort within this one country. So I know that kind of was a very broad brush stroke in terms of the things that we've been doing, but as I mentioned, the focus really has been about thinking about what our efforts are for gender and empowering women, but then also over this past year, we've had to make plenty of adjustments with regard to how those vulnerable groups, either whether it's in those public open spaces, whether it's about combating violence in Honduras, or about land titling, making those adjustments to implement those best practices in other communities. So I'll pause there, and I know that there's a little bit of time for Q&A now, and then later on in the panel. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was very interesting and helpful to be looking at this through the lens of USAID. I'm going to just check now to see if there's any questions from the audience, and in the Q&A, it looks like we have a question here. It says, I'm currently working on research regarding the impact of the pandemic on women in the labor force market. And there's been a lot of research conducted on women disproportionately in low-wage jobs being impacted, and also the lack of proper childcare infrastructure. Have you seen any projects or policies geared toward alleviating the impact regarding these?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I mentioned, so the broader framing that we have, as I mentioned, kind of borrows from this women's empowerment. And because of this kind of the stratification of applying that to existing programming, I do know that our Gender Development Office does look at that specifically in terms of women in the labor force market, and I can certainly follow up with some additional resources to this group to answer that. I don't have any research right offhand, but I know with that that focus on women's empowerment, I know that there are projects focused on that. I just don't have them right at hand. But I'd be glad to follow
and that's
up
great. That's great to know. I mean, this is a great question to come up, because again, these are the kinds of follow-up things we can be identifying to think about, where does the dialogue need to go? This is a very tangible solution to think about how to assist women's and women's issues, family issues, household issues, and to take it to the next step. So I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next panelist. And we will have time for conversation after this. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Thank you, Melinda.
Our next panelist is Dr. Matthew Lorenzen. I hope I'm saying that right, Matthew. Matthew is a sociologist who got his degree from the Paris University and the Panthéon-Sorbonne. He's currently an associate researcher at the Unidad Académica de Estudios Territoriales, Oaxaca. It's a research center that's located in Oaxaca City, and it belongs to the Institute of Geography of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. He's carried out postdoctoral research at the University of Southern California, and he also is a consultant at the Mexico's National Population Council. Matthew's talk today is the gendered social and economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and rural women's livelihood strategies in Mexico's Mixteca Alta region. So with that, Matthew, I'll turn over the presentation to you.
Thank you, Melinda, and good morning to everybody. Just share my screen. Right, so the presentation is the gendered social and economic impacts of the COVID pandemic and rural women's livelihood strategies in Mexico's Mixteca Alta region. So before talking about my case study, it's important to briefly note that there's an emerging literature on the social and economic impacts of the pandemic on women. And this literature has focused on three main impacts. One is the expansion of violence against women and girls as a result of lockdowns and forced cohabitation with abusers. The second is the increase in the household workload, which is linked especially to school closures, which has affected mothers especially. And the third impact, which I'm going to focus more on, is the harsh impacts on female-dominated economic activities, especially in retail and the service sector, especially those jobs that cannot be done remotely, such as domestic work, food and drink services, accommodation, etc. So, however, there are gaps in the literature, which is normal because it's just coming out. One of those gaps is the lack of studies on individual and household livelihood strategies during the pandemic. There has been attention on coping strategies, on negative coping strategies, such as borrowing money, using up savings, or selling assets. But these strategies can actually jeopardize livelihoods. So there is a lack of studies on the agency of people to try to survive, right? And lastly, there is a lack of gender perspective in these studies on coping strategies. So my case study focuses on two municipalities in the Mixteca Alta region, which is in the southern state of Oaxaca in Mexico, about 90 kilometers from the state capital, Oaxaca City. The first municipality is Yanhuitlán, which has a population of about 1,600 people. And the other municipality is Tonaltepec, which is a really small municipality of only 250 people. So the contrast there is interesting. And even though I focus on rural areas, it's important to note that the connection with cities is really important, especially the regional city of Nochistlán, as I'll explain later. The first results are regarding the gendered impacts of the pandemic. And my research, which is based mainly on interviews with key informants, confirms some of the findings in the literature. So indeed, school closures led to an increased household workload in the two municipalities, which has essentially affected mothers because of social gender norms that attribute the role of caregiving to them. And as a result, women have had to sacrifice rest and leisure time, and in some cases, paid work time. However, according to the interviews, there was no noticeable increase in violence against women and girls during the pandemic, which goes against what the literature suggests. And informants explained this by noting that the main economic activities carried out by men, especially farming and construction, were not affected by lockdowns. So there wasn't this forced cohabitation with abusers. On the contrary, our informants noted that the economic activities most affected are those carried out predominantly by women, especially retail, artisanal manufacturing, and certain services, especially in the food and drink sector. So in our first municipality, we noticed the closure of 3 small hotels that are owned by women and have mainly female workers, the closure of 3 restaurants that are owned and or operated by women, the closure of a Sunday gastronomic market that affected about 12 women, and also 20 domestic workers were laid off because of the fear of contracting COVID, and they are all women. So the impact on women is really clear. In Tonaltepec, the other municipality, 7 women who used to prepare meals for tourists lost that source of income, and also 15 women who make pottery that was previously sold to tourists, and at a Sunday market in the city of Nochistlán, they lost also that source of income. So this is just the example of this occupation, the sale and production and sale of pottery in Tonaltepec, which is a female-dominated occupation. And these women who lost their income, they haven't stayed still. They've implemented a series of strategies to try to maintain their livelihoods. And we can group those strategies in 3 categories. One is the increased use of local natural resources. So we noted that in a context where money has become scarcer and supply chains have been affected, women are gathering more firewood instead of buying gas. And also women are gathering wild food products to avoid buying groceries and having to go to the city of Nochistlán to the market. The second group of strategies are backyard farming strategies. So more women are tending to backyard vegetable gardens, and they are also raising more backyard animals such as chickens, turkeys, and rabbits. And the third group of strategies, which is really the main group of strategies, is small-scale trade strategies. So we see that women are selling their surplus vegetables and eggs from their backyard gardens. They are starting to sell wild food products. And most importantly, they are selling prepared food, such as homemade bread, handmade tortillas, and typical Oaxacan dishes and desserts. So these women go around door to door selling to their neighbors. But in Yahuitlán, they also have other marketing strategies. For example, the 3 restaurants have been able to sell takeout food. There was also a motorcycle home delivery service that appeared, and women take advantage of this service to sell their prepared food and other products. And most importantly, they have started to use social media, a Facebook page and several WhatsApp groups to sell their prepared food and other products that they sell. So this is just an example of the many products that are advertised on this Yahuitlán Sales Facebook page. You can see backyard eggs, bread, vegetables from backyard vegetable gardens, but also makeup, clothes, prepared food, etc. So I'd like to end my talk by mentioning some future research opportunities that incorporate a geospatial focus, which is central to this symposium. And I think there's much to learn by comparing the social and economic impacts of the pandemic between rural and urban areas. And the first possibility is comparing the increase in gender violence. So my research suggests that rural areas may not have been affected so much because men's occupations have continued pretty much as normal, but this obviously needs to be confirmed or rejected with geospatial data. The second possibility is comparing the increased household workload and how it is distributed between genders. And the literature has already suggested that women in rural areas are more affected by this because of stricter social gender norms. And a third possibility is comparing the impacts of lockdowns on men's and women's occupations in rural and urban areas. So my work suggests that rural men's occupations, such as farming, have continued pretty much as normal, as opposed to occupations that are typically carried out by women. And lastly, we can compare the increased economic inequalities between men and women in rural and urban areas because of the differentiated impacts by gender, right? So in all four cases, there is a need to collect and analyze data for urban and rural areas to be able to reject or confirm these and other ideas about the differentiated impacts of the pandemic. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for that very informative and interesting presentation. To bring the issues of rural women's livelihoods to the fore is a critical aspect of all of this. One of the key themes throughout the symposium that we've seen is this issue of connectivity. So being able to understand the role of food supply chains, how they intersect across the urban-rural landscape is essential to all of this. And that's really a critical aspect of things. I'm going to just check the Q&A. I think we have a question here. It says, thank you for such an interesting presentation. I'm curious about the demographic characteristics of the women. Could you tell us more about their race, ethnicity, and educational attainment? Are there any NGOs currently working with rural women in the Mixteca Alta region?
Right, so this is a mainly rural and an indigenous area. So they're part of the Mixtecos indigenous group. Although they've pretty much lost the language. They all speak Spanish. They haven't really been able to, the language hasn't really been able to survive. Regarding educational attainment, it really depends on the municipality. So we saw that Yanguitlan is better located. It's in the valley. It has a high school. So people there are pretty well off. But in the other municipality, which is in the mountains, people have primary school basically. So even though they're neighboring municipalities, there are stark differences. Regarding NGOs, there are a few NGOs, but they work on forests and environmental issues. What we have seen is several government programs, but they have focused more on men. So one program is to give landholders money to plant orchards in their plots, but almost 80% of landholders are men. So these policies have aided men, but not women. So there are gendered biases in the policies that the government has implemented.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matthew, for that answer to that question. I think that also reveals the need to understand how different things can be in such a close spatial arrangement. That one place can be actually doing relatively well, and the place right next door could be doing not so well. So being able to tease out those details are going to be another key aspect of how we resolve some of these issues and where we go next. So thank you, Matthew. I'm going to turn now to our final panelist, which is Dr. Carlos Mena. Dr. Mena is a professor of geography and ecology at the School of Biological and Environmental Sciences at the Universidad San Francisco de Quito. Carlos is the co-director of the Galapagos Science Center and the director of the Institute of Geography at that institution. Carlos is also was a project lead during our secondary cities project that we had from 2015 to 2019. And Carlos is now also the C2M2 Latin America hub lead. And with that, Carlos, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Melinda. Can you hear me okay? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you very much. As Melinda said, I'm Carlos Mena, professor of geography at the Universidad San Francisco de Quito. And what I'm going to present this morning is the impacts of COVID-19 in Quito, in the spatial patterns of domestic violence. And this is an initiative of the Cities COVID-19 Mitigation Mapping C2M2 project. Just to give you a little bit of overview of our Latin American hub, is composed by 6 cities, Quito, Cusco, Santa Cruz in Galapagos, Lima, Santiago de Chile, and Ouro Preto in Brazil. So a diversity of cities that try to present case scenarios of what is the situation in Latin America. And what we try to understand, as you know probably, that Latin America is one of the regions that has been most affected by the COVID pandemics. The objectives of Latin American Hub includes the analysis of extreme poverty, inequality, forced migration and mobility, food insecurity, lack of access to education, and the emergence of violence and other legal activities. So a very wide range of activities that we are exploring. More specifically, we really want to focus on poverty across the Andean region, map and understand mobility and migration in Quito, Lima, and Santiago, but also understand the consequence of the collapse of the tourism economy in very dependent areas like the Galapagos Islands, Cusco in Peru, and Ouro Preto in Brazil. This morning, we want to talk more about a focus of the project in Quito, which is domestic violence. And we know that women are affected more than men by the social or economic effects of infectious diseases outbreaks in general, and especially or specifically during the COVID pandemic. They bear the brunt of care responsibilities as a school closed and family members fell ill. Women are more greater risk of domestic violence and are disproportionately disadvantaged by reduced access to sexual and reproductive health services. In our region, especially, women are more likely to men to be unemployed or have fewer hours of employment work. So this is something where we want to focus our attention during this talk. And we are using Quito as a case study. Quito is the capital of Ecuador. Is a city which has a population of more than 2 million people. It's a very long city. The geographic center contains a commercial center and a historic center, while the extremes are residential areas, which also contain poor neighborhoods. So here in red, we can see poor neighborhoods, and the center has less poverty. In this case, we are using domestic violence generated by the General Prosecutor's Office, la Fiscalía General del Estado, and this is reported or formal complaints. So there is an issue of who goes to reporting violence, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. And we have reports about physical, psychological, sexual violence, and femicides for 2018 and 19 and 2020. We'll see here a comparison between 2019 and 2020. And what we want to show is the temporal patterns of violence, but also to explore the spatial patterns of violence and talk a little bit about the drivers of domestic violence and the drivers of reporting at the city level. In general, at global scales, we can see that crimes and stay-at-home restrictions are related to crime. This study that was published a few weeks ago in Nature shows and compares crime in 27 cities across 23 countries in America, Europe, and Middle East. And what this study finds is that stay-at-home policies were associated with a considerable drop in urban crime, with substantial variation across cities and types of crimes. They also show that more stringent restrictions over movement in public spaces were predictive of larger decline of crimes. So we wanted to see if these patterns where we can see declines in crime are also true in Quito and in different types of domestic violence. What we can observe in Quito, this blue line here represents the number of cases of domestic violence per day since 2018. The gray line is a trend, and the red line is the beginning of stay-at-home orders. In other words, is the beginning of the mobility restrictions in Ecuador. What we can see here is that the reporting of domestic violence dropped drastically after stay-at-home orders, but bounced back once mobility restrictions are eased. Here also a clear pattern of this drop after the restrictions when we compare year to year. What about the categories of domestic violence in Quito? We can see that physical and psychological violence follow the same pattern, while femicides and sexual violence is a little bit more difficult to see a trend. But in all the cases, we can see that there is a drop and there is an increase of different types of violence after restrictions are open again.
Carlos, about 1 more minute.
Yes, in terms of domestic violence, we can see also that there is a shift in spatial patterns. If we compare 19 to, as a reference to the year 2020. And this is true in all types of restrictions. And if we want to see what are the drivers of violence and what are the drivers of reporting of violence, we can see the lockdown had a negative effect on violence. Variables related to employment and economic dependency are related to domestic violence. And what is important to know is that the distance to complex places is also statistical significance. What we can see is that this is a very highly dynamic process, but domestic violence is related to different stages of mobility. Spatial patterns displace or violence is displaced from the center to the periphery during these stages of movement. And what we can see is that lockdown, employment, education, and economic dependency are very important to explain violence. One immediate policy suggestion is that reporting of violence methods, including physical places to report, and virtual platforms should be created in residential areas and really move with people where violence occurs. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for that very provocative and interesting presentation, Carlos. This is a difficult topic to tease out the details and to understand these issues. Before I open it up for further questions, I do have a question for you. I know that you're getting data from the government on these kinds of metrics, but also what's being done in terms of sort of the ethical implications of, as you start to do spatially explicit analysis on this, identify neighborhoods that potentially may be more problems with crime, problems with these kinds of issues. What do you do to sort of protect the people that we're actually taking a look at and trying to assist?
Yes, there is a lot of ethical implications in how we analyze data, and of course one is privacy, and the main idea behind the study is also to create standards in how that are feed into organizations such as the Fiscalia, the Prosecutor's Office, and the policy and the police, who are producing data, especially explicit data, in many cases to the public. So we want to create with them these standards for sharing of data and publishing of data. Right now, most of the data is aggregated and you have different restrictions, but there is a lot of pressure from the academic and journalistic communities to make data more readily available.
Thanks, Carlos. Matthew, I just wondered if you wanted to follow up on that at all, if any of these sort of issues came up in the research that you were conducting.
Not particularly, but I did want to mention one thing, that police data or data about calls to violence helplines, it's really problematic because when lockdowns were first instituted, women could no longer call violence helplines or go to the police because they are stuck with their abusers at home. So this drop in domestic violence is actually quite logical.
Thanks.
One of the advantages that we have in our Quito is that we can compare, and our team will present this later, is police reports, the 911 call, and the reports from the Fiscalia, but also we're implementing a household survey, so we can really try to understand what is the gap between the violence that occur at home and the violence that is called to an emergency phone and the violence that is reported. Obviously, there will be lots of differences there.
Thanks, Carlos. Kevin, I would want to ask you quickly before we have a question from the audience. You mentioned in Tunisia looking at human rights and women's issues. How does this topic play into some of the work that USAID is doing?
Yeah, thanks for that. And as I mentioned previously, most of the investments that we're making now are based on, continuation or follow-up of existing investments. It's not to say that we're not innovating, but the project in Tunisia that we're doing with Cities Alliance is a continuation of a longer-term democracy and governance program in Tunisia, where looking at a variety of cities, and I having gone there maybe 3 or 4 years ago, in the city of Beja, I definitely remember. That was one of the core secondary cities that we were focused on, where, women, part of that project was really to basically give women a seat at the table at municipal governance, and whether there were some elected officials, or in terms of being in charge of different ministries within the city, that project has kind of moved forward in that, in getting that broader array of representation. And that was one of the things that the mayor of Tunis, she wanted to kind of bring forth that spirit of thinking about the role of women as a human right of being represented. And that's where that confluence happened with investments that Cities Alliance was already making in and around Tunis with their country programming, but doing something in those open, in those public spaces where women could have a much more active and vocal role in programming. So so we're seeing some of that leverage and continuation of kind of philosophical thinking about the ways that transparency and accountability in secondary cities comes with that representation and that and that voice. Over.
Great, thank you, Kevin. I see that we have a question from Paul Robinson in the audience. Paul, I think you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question. Are you still there?
Oh yeah, actually that was an accident. The hand raising.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
So as follow-up to some of the discussion that's going on here and thinking about this critical important, I guess my question that I would have for the three panelists is, what do you think are the mechanisms where women can actually have greater representation? We talk a lot about these issues, and we talk a lot about how getting information into women's hands and doing these things, but how do we actually operationalize that and make something come from this is what I would pose to you. And so with that, I guess I'll start with you, Matthew, if you have any comments.
For me, I think the important action that needs to be done is through policy. So what we noticed in the study area, as I mentioned earlier, is that the policies that were implemented during the pandemic, not necessarily because of the pandemic, but they coincided with the pandemic. Two of the most important policies were gender biased. So as I said, one policy was to give landholders money to plant orchards, and another policy was to pave rural roads. And these two policies helped men, but not women, because men are construction workers, men are farmers. So there hasn't been any policies designed specifically for women. And that's the focus, that's where the focus needs to be, because if it's true that COVID, that the social and economic impacts of COVID have been harsher for women, there needs to be a response from the policy side, implementing gender sensitive policies. So that's my comment.
Thank you. Any follow-up from Kevin or Carlos on that question?
Yeah, just quickly about that. I completely agree about the policy implications. But one thing that we're seeing both at USAID, kind of broadly in our gender development office, but then also with a variety of different work groups, as well as how we take that gender lens into our programming, is, it has to be a perspective of not only just, the advocacy for women, which is, the important crux of it, but then also having, men be part of that conversation, be part of that realization of, changing those policies, because it provides a more equitable environment for all residents. And so we take note of when there are work groups that are set up that are only women focused on gender. So needing and certainly by the fact that this panel is three men talking about gender, I think has a positive impact as well. So thinking in those terms.
So I'm going to also just quickly, before I turn to you, Carlos, that we have a question in the Q&A as well that I want to add to this. And the question is for, are you doing for all of you, are you doing a full volunteerism or are receiving any kind of financial assistance? Or maybe those activities are part of your duties. So I guess the various activities you're doing, how are they supported and who funds them? Carlos, go ahead, please.
Yes, well, our specific project is funded by the mapgive C2M2 project, and the project or the hub includes the 6 cities I mentioned during my presentation, and we are mainly using funds to collect data and to analyze data. So going back to your question, Melinda, we are also finding and learning how different types of policies will be more effective. And as Matthew mentioned before, you know, there is a lot of cultural factors that make more difficult for women to report domestic violence, but also there are geographic accessibility problems related to that. So lockdown probably not just decrease domestic violence, but also decrease reporting. So we think in places like Quito, where you have central places where you have to go and report, doesn't work during different stages of lockdown. But it have to, the Fiscalia, the police, local governments create facilities and make it easier to report for women. And one important finding also in our studies is that places that or sectors that have more women in terms of proportion to men have lower domestic violence, lower cases of domestic violence. And we suspect that this is related also to social cohesion in some ways, where you have more organized groups and more organized support activities for women too. So I think communities, local and national governments should put more attention to reporting facilities and also help to build cohesion, social cohesion.
Melinda, if I could just make one other quick point, just I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that Administrator Power had gone to the Northern Triangle the week before last, and in her meetings, and this gets to your point, she emphasized the importance of good governance, the role of civil society, and anti-corruption efforts, and she reiterated USAID's firm commitment to help improve prosperity and security in the country, in Honduras, as well as in El Salvador and Guatemala, and discussed the importance of providing legal pathways to migration, along with a lot of other things. But the underlying point, I think, and this is something that I'm kind of struggling with in terms of, in the Democracy and Governance Center, is really demonstrating and shining a light on the fact that when we're talking about migration, when we're talking about physical security, there, as these things are all interrelated, we can address, some of the symptoms or some of the causes of migration. And I know that was kind of a different panel, but when we think about gender and how to make populations more secure, all of these things are interrelated, which I know that everyone on this symposium knows that, but, or hope, ideally knows that. But I think it's important to think about things not only at the local level, which Matthew and Carlos were dealing with, but then also at this multilateral, multinational policy, and how those two things come together. Over.
Thank you so much for that, Kevin. And I'm going to actually close the session now. Ahmed, I see that you have your hand raised, and what I'm going to ask you to do is if you would please put your question in the Q&A so we can have that as a placeholder, and probably at the end of the session today, we can hopefully cover that. With that, I'd like to thank our panelists for a very rich discussion and for excellent presentations. We so appreciate your participation in the session and the symposium, and we look forward to future collaboration with all of you in the work that important work that we're doing. With that, we're going to go on to our coffee break. We have a short break for about 10 minutes. And so this is a moment to get up, stretch your legs, get a cup of coffee, and then come back and we'll start with the lightning talks after the break. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Melinda.
Thank you.
Welcome back. We're about ready to start our lightning talk session. We have 4 lightning talks to share with. We have 4 lightning talks to share with you that will highlight the Cities COVID Mitigation Mapping Program. The first one we'll start with is from Bukavu, the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is called the Second Order Impacts on Education. It's by Eurofilm Jesus Mckay Pombo das Devidas. So we'll share this with you. Ready to go, Johan?
Okay, let me turn on the video.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm Benedict Bashimbe. I'm a senior lecturer from Bukavu, Official University, Bukavu. Official University is the state university in the eastern part of the Congo. Well, COVID-19 is really a very, very bad thing for our students. Last year, our students spent a number of months at home, something like 6 months at home without studying, which is really bringing negative effects to our academic activities. Students, girls, were pregnant during that period of confinement, which couldn't help them to come back. Students today in the classrooms are quite unable to observe the physical distancing that they should be observing. And also there is no vaccine so far. The vaccine, many parents are still afraid of sending their children to get vaccination, which is really a problem as well.
Je m'appelle Samovadira Kashure Gislaine. Je suis mariée, mère de 9 enfants. Je travaille à l'Université officielle de Bukavu, à la faculté des lettres et sciences humaines. Le Covid 2019 a vraiment fait un impact très négatif au niveau de l'université officielle parce que ça a perturbé non seulement l'année académique, mais aussi ça nous a mis dans une distraction. On ne sait pas quand est-ce que ça a commencé, on ne sait pas quand est-ce que ça va finir. On n'a pas d'espoir. D'ailleurs, bon nombre de nos étudiants sont venus chez eux et ils n'ont plus moyens parce que le Covid a handicapé les travaux de leurs parents et peut-être pour leur alimentation. Rien vraiment, ils sont en souffrance.
Corona has become a serious problem in many families. As far as the income of each family is concerned, today families are suffering. And as far as students are concerned, I may say that Corona has become a serious problem, especially on the students' performance. This is what I can say. The impact is very, very negative, and it will have a result on students' performance this year. That we don't, even today, we are uncertain if we can finish the year because of those who I hear by the radio broadcasting that there will be another confinement. I don't know. And if it is true. Really, we don't know how we are going to behave.
Bonjour, moi c'est Denise, je suis étudiante de la G3 du MED ici à l'IOB, à Bukavu.
Merci beaucoup Denise. Et vous, mademoiselle?
Bonjour, moi c'est Quito, je suis aussi l'une des étudiants de l'IOB en G3 biomède.
C'est vrai quoi, le COVID-19 a eu un impact sur nos études. Premièrement, on n'a pas étudié on a étudié seulement pour finir l'année. On n'a pas étudié pour maîtriser la matière parce que souvent les professeurs étaient pressés de finir l'année, n'ont pas eu le temps de bien nous encadrer pour qu'on comprenne la matière. Et on commence à avoir des impacts aujourd'hui sur ce qu'on étudie maintenant dans cette année. Parce qu'on trouve qu'il y a des choses qu'on devrait connaître quand on était dans l'année passée, mais qu'on n'a pas pu connaître à cause du Covid-19.
Bon, vis-à-vis de ce que ma précédente vient de dire, je ne pense pas que j'ai beaucoup encore à dire, mais ce qu'elle a dit là est vrai. Vraiment, Covid a perturbé notre année. on étudiait plus pour comprendre, mais on étudiait plutôt pour finir l'année. Il y a des moments où le professeur nous disait juste qu'il voulait terminer. Donc, il nous disait qu'on n'avait plus du temps à perdre. On étudiait juste pour terminer, donc. Et c'est ce qu'on est en train de voir aujourd'hui. Ça commence vraiment à nous assurer.
Congolese, exactly. I live in Bukavu, South Kivu province, Ibanda commune, Albeka FU. We have observed so a decreased number of students because after the lockdown, they did not come the way we expected, and some of them abandoned, went away, and this impacts negatively to our institution. Another thing to say is that when they came back, they lost essentials concerning the materials. So we were obliged as teachers to resume, to restart. And as well, you know, teachers were suffering a lot during the 9 months, past months, especially private teachers. They were not receiving their wages, no salary. You know, we were living for the sake of living, no food, and this was horrible. And the government did not even take this into account.
Au regard des impacts négatifs de la COVID-19 sur le fonctionnement des établissements scolaires comme le LAPO, ce que je pourrais renchérir, c'est que la plupart des élèves qui sont passés des classes de l'année passée pour cette année n'ont pas eu le niveau parce que le programme n'a pas été achevé. Et ça, c'est vraiment à tous les niveaux, et au maternel, au primaire et au secondaire. Et on l'a senti dans leur rendement cette année scolaire, que ce soit au primaire, que ce soit au secondaire. Des élèves qui savaient déjà écrire, au primaire par exemple, il fallait revenir encore, et ça a encore impacté sur la poursuite du programme, pour le respect du programme. Bon, je ne sais pas s'il faut parler aussi des aspects positifs. Par exemple, maintenant, avec la Covid, les gens savent qu'il faut maintenant des règles d'hygiène qu'il faut respecter. Donc, il y a aussi du positif.
Thank you to our Bukavu team for this presentation and discussion about the issues of education. Our next presentation is, our next lightning talk is from Pemba, Mozambique. The title of this is The Impacts of the COVID-19 Pandemic on Pemba. This was put together by Dr. Mulangabalu Mabalasa. Thanks.
Em Moçambique, o primeiro caso de Covid-19 foi oficialmente registrado em março de 2020 na cidade de Maputo, e com 7 casos diagnosticados, Moçambique declarou estado de emergência e adotou várias medidas para combater a pandemia a fim de evitar o colapso do sistema de saúde devido à sua fragilidade e deficiência. No entanto, na cidade de Pemba, estas medidas tiveram um impacto nas famílias, a ponto de alguns chefes de família terem visto os seus salários reduzidos, o que influenciou o seu poder de compra, colocando-os numa situação de vulnerabilidade social. Isto associado à crise de água, que é fundamental para o processo de saneamento neste momento. Além disso, as famílias tiveram que passar pelo estresse de viver com toda a família em casa, o que era invulgar antes da pandemia, exigindo mais paciência e tolerância da parte deles. como conta na primeira pessoa Adriano Mulieca, um jovem negociante que viu tudo parar depois de ser decretado o estado de emergência em Moçambique.
Fazia a venda de perfumes. Este negócio surgiu através de uma oportunidade de um amigo, um conterrâneo, né, que responde por nome de Sérgio, que ele deu-me esta oportunidade e graças a Deus eu pude abraçar aquela oportunidade e nós caminhamos, andamos e tudo foi tranquilamente perfeito até então, onde a Covid-19 veio parar tudo. O negócio depois da Covid-19 pude parar porque os perfumes que nós vendíamos, neste caso, eles eram importados do Maputo, né? Eles vinham de transporte, no caso de avião. Então, quando a pandemia afetou todo mundo, né? E depois limitaram o número de voos, ou seja, não havia transporte, né? Essa coisa, os aviões não circulavam. Daí que o negócio foi parando, porque não tínhamos como importar. Quando decretaram a emergência, eu não tenho como, porque está tudo parado, não consigo fazer nada. Mas graças ao meu irmão, que tem me dado uma mão, tem me apoiado, e assim passo a vida. Bem, eu conseguia me sustentar, porque sabendo que sou estudante, depois também vivo com alguém, esse alguém também tem mais responsabilidades, não é? De antemão eu usava esse dinheiro para usar para transporte, cópias na faculdade, não é? Aquelas necessidades da escola, para atender toda a necessidade delas, não é? Exatamente.
Por outro lado, o encerramento das escolas fez aumentar o consumo de alimentos, o que levou à escassez de alimentos nestas famílias e a mais cuidados com as crianças, pois não se aperceberam que o encerramento era uma medida para reduzir a propagação da Covid e continuou a circular nas ruas e mercados.
And thank you to our Pemba team that really highlights the importance of individual stories and how really one individual experiences all these different aspects of the pandemic that tells the story so eloquently. Our next lightning talk is from our partners in Cusco, Peru. The title is Evidence of the Side Effect of the COVID-19 Pandemic in the Educational Field in the Cusco region, Peru. This is by Delia Ramos and Santos Mera.
En esta oportunidad somos el ingeniero Santos Mera y la ingeniera Delia Ramos, quienes vamos a presentar los avances del proyecto Efectos secundarios del COVID en la educación en la región del Cusco. El Cusco se encuentra en la parte sur del Perú, es uno de los 24 departamentos y 25 regiones. Está dividido en 13 provincias y 112 distritos. Tiene más de 1 millón de habitantes y el 37% aproximadamente se concentra en la capital. La altitud promedio de la ciudad es de 3.399 metros sobre el nivel del mar. Podemos ver en este gráfico que la mayor cantidad de la población se concentra en la capital de la región. La educación ha tenido una dinámica a la inversa de lo que venía sucediendo con regularidad hasta el año 2019. Por lo general la población se mantenía un 77% o 75% en la parte urbana y en la parte rural entre un 20-25%, que es el complemento. Para el año 2020 podemos notar que se ha reducido la cantidad de población en la parte urbana, sin embargo esa reducción se ve incrementada en la parte rural. En este cuadro resumen, en la parte final podemos ver el total de la población educativa que abarca las diferentes modalidades de educación, que se ha reducido en un 12.59% y en la educación básica regular en un 14.08%. Ese mismo porcentaje es el que se ha incrementado en la parte rural del año 2019 al 2020. Lo normal es que la población venga del campo a la ciudad, sin embargo para este año han tenido que invertir este proceso por el efecto de la pandemia. Esto también tiene que ver con la parte de despidos y la reducción de las actividades económicas en la ciudad. Podemos ver acá el decremento de la población total, que está en color azul, y la educación básica regular, que está en el color marrón. Esto es para la parte urbana, y para la parte rural, bueno, el incremento, que es el mismo porcentaje, en color azul para la población educación, y para educación básica regular, el 14.08%, que es lo mismo en positivo. Podemos ver también acá por la normativa del Ministerio de Educación del Perú los diferentes tipos y modalidades de educación. Hemos elaborado un mapa de densidad de antenas de cobertura móvil y también de conexiones de internet fija para ver cómo es que se han incrementado o han variado estas conexiones. No hemos agregado en este cuadro la de la provincia Cusco porque ha sido muy drástica y por escala no se podría representar, pero vemos que para el año 2020 se han incrementado mucho en algunos lugares. Acá podemos notar el cambio drástico. De la ciudad del Cusco, de la provincia del Cusco, ha habido una variación negativa de 49.249 conexiones. ¿Esto qué quiere decir? Que la gente se ha ido de la capital y se han ido al campo, y eso es lo que ha incrementado en el campo. Sin embargo, en los mapas de calor que tenemos para el año 2019, que vemos acá, y para el año 2020, pues podemos ver que la cobertura de internet no abarca toda la región. Esto tiene que ver también con la parte del territorio, ¿no? El efecto de la geografía. La geografía es muy agreste. En el Cusco tenemos la cordillera de los Andes y tenemos la parte oriental del Perú, la parte de la selva en la parte norte en la convención. Acá también hemos representado el sistema eléctrico y el consumo de energía eléctrica a nivel de las redes, y hemos visto a nivel de kilómetros del servicio o de las conexiones que hay de energía. Podemos ver que se han incrementado del 2019 al 2020. Acá tenemos un cuadro a nivel del consumo en megavatios y también en la facturación. En este cuadro resumen hemos tratado de presentar 4 criterios básicos que vienen a ser las instituciones educativas, la cantidad de instituciones educativas, el internet o las conexiones fijas de internet, el internet a nivel de antenas móvil o el servicio de antenas de cobertura móvil y el servicio eléctrico. Bajo estos 4 criterios hemos tratado de ver en qué condiciones se encontraba la región ante la presencia de la pandemia. Podemos mostrar acá un cuadro en el que hemos ponderado, hemos asignado rangos de valores y también porcentajes de importancia, considerando el máximo para las instituciones educativas, ya que de no tener instituciones educativas, bueno, la educación se detendría. El segundo criterio más importante es el del sistema eléctrico, que sin electricidad, bueno, no se podría realizar ningún tipo de conexión a la telefonía o a las computadoras o a la televisión, a la red de televisión nacional y de radio, mediante los cuales se imparte aprendo en casa. Como tercer nivel de estos criterios está la cobertura de internet, tanto fija como móvil. Los pesos tienen que ver según la importancia de cada uno de ellos, ya que la internet móvil, si bien es cierto, debería de llegar a más partes del Perú, no es tan continuo, este servicio constantemente oscila, y las conexiones fijas son las que tienen mayor estabilidad. Entonces hemos tratado de ponderar a nivel de instituciones educativas, contando la cantidad de instituciones educativas por distrito. Luego hemos hecho lo mismo para las conexiones fijas, para las conexiones móviles y para el sistema eléctrico en base a la cantidad de red que se tiene en la región. Luego de haber clasificado todo esto, hemos multiplicado, hemos sumado los valores. Finalmente tenemos que, si bien esto es algo más subjetivo en base a la evaluación que hemos realizado, podríamos seguir incrementando más criterios como la densidad poblacional o el área total de cada provincia y el área ocupada por la población, y estos criterios podrían ir mejorando la apreciación de cómo es que se encontraba cada una de estas provincias ante la presencia de una pandemia, o revelando la situación real en la que se encontraba la región para enfrentar una situación del cambio de la educación tradicional, presencial, a una educación virtual o a distancia, ¿no? Donde la geografía juega un papel importante, y obviamente también la infraestructura de red y el acceso a equipos de telefonía o de computación. Entonces, los dos provincias que han estado en mejores condiciones, no quiere decir que sean del todo buenas, ¿no?, en mejores condiciones comparadas al resto, han sido la del Cusco, que es la capital, y la de la Convención, que tiene que ver con las actividades que se realizan en estos lugares, la cantidad de población, la accesibilidad, y bueno, algunas explicaciones más se pueden dar, pero principalmente todo esto ha sido evaluado en base a estos 4 criterios. Esperamos que esto haya sido de utilidad. Muchas gracias.
Great, thank you to our Cusco team. I think this really brings out an important aspect of these projects and of the pandemic, thinking about the relationship between trying to address educational issues, talking about supply chains, talking about electricity, all of these things, and its relationship to infrastructure, the importance of infrastructure to be able to address these issues. So thank you to our Cusco team. And our last lightning talk, which will focus on domestic violence in Quito, Ecuador during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is by Byron Lozada and Patricia Martinez.
Good morning, everyone. This is my team of C2M2 of Quito, and I'm going to present our analysis on domestic violence in Quito during the COVID-19. The purpose of our study is to determine the temporal and spatial patterns of domestic violence in the city of Quito before, during, and after the conflict. Then, it is important to mention that the data comes from 2 official sources. The State's Attorney General Office, which is based on complaints, and from EQ911, which are emergency calls. For this presentation, we will use the information from emergency calls between 2019 and 2020. We had 2 categories with the highest number of cases, such as psychological and physical violence. For the methods, we first intersect the EQ911 database with the census sector, and then we perform 3 analyses: temporal pattern, spatial pattern, and a regression and mobility. The EQ911 database is composed of the date of incidents, category, and coordinates, while the study unit is based on census sector, which are geographic areas defined with the purpose of conducting census. With the intersection of these bases, we obtain the cases by census. With the temporal analysis of the data, we can observe that within the trends, the number of cases decreased in September 2020, and with the STL decomposition, a temporal pattern of the data is not observed, rather present random. In the Watson test analysis, we can conclude that the data does not have a similarity within the total number of cases of domestic violence, or by the most representative categories, such as psychological and physical violence. Once the temporal part of the data has been analyzed, we continue with the spatial patterns. The first thing we want to analyze was the spatial distribution of the data. We use Getty's or G-statistic for this part, which allow us to identify a statistical significant hot and cold spots in our study area. As you can see, we are showing a comparison of maps by months per year for physical violence. Visually, a group distribution is observed for both cold and hot spots, and if we analyze the standard deviation and the p-value, we realize the distribution variate between years. If we do the same analysis for psychological violence, we realize the data is grouped for 2020. On the other hand, to identify the correlation of the data between the years, we use bivariate spatial autocorrelation. Through these tools, we were able to identify the time correlation, the space correlation, and the time-space correlation. And finally, we were able to generate a map where we can observe the behavior of the sectors according to the cases of domestic violence for these 2 years. In example, I'm going to show the results of physical violence. The high, we identify the high clusters with the highest incidence. Low are the low clusters with the lowest incidence of cases, and outliers, the low-high, are called areas with a lower of cases, but surrounded by sectors where there are higher rates of violence, and the high-low are hot areas. High rates of violence are run by cold areas with lower rates of violence. Thanks.
I am now going to present all these steps that we follow to do the regression analysis. First, we add and collapse the emergency phone calls database of the ECU 911 in order to have the total number of phone calls by census sector. Then, phone calls were grouped according to the type of violence: physical, psychological, sexual, and femicide. From the same database, the variables of parish, census sector, year, and month were obtained. Also, an indicator was created for the confinement period. This variable takes values of 1 during the months in which the social confinement was enforced and 0 the rest of the time. This new database was merged with the relevant information from the 2010 population and housing census. The variables that you can see in the slide were created for each census sector, including different poverty and vulnerability indicators constructed according to the unsatisfied basic needs methodology. Moreover, we are aware that probably one of the factors that explain the levels of domestic violence in each census sector is the size of the population. Therefore, it was necessary to carry out a projection of the population at the census sector level for the years 2019 and 2020. You can see the way we carry out this projection here in the slide. At the end of all this data management process, a final database of the census sector level was obtained, which was used to perform the regression analysis that I am going to describe next. Initially, using the ordinary least square method, different linear regression models for physical and psychological violence were estimated. In both regressions that you can see, the fixed effects of the years, months, and parishes were controlled for. However, we realized that there might be some multicollinearity problems because some of the independent variables seem highly correlated with each other. We confirmed that suspect when we look at the correlation matrix that you can see in the slide. Therefore, it was necessary to remove some variables from the models. Moreover, there is no guarantee that the random variables in these models have the same variability between observations. That is, some observations may have a greater variation than others. This describes a condition known as heteroscedasticity. There are several ways to detect heteroscedasticity in a model. Two of them, based on Lagrange multipliers, are the Broch-Pagan tests and the White test. Using both tests, we confirmed that the residuals are heteroscedastic. Given that the least squares method is inefficient in heteroscedastic models, we decided to use another unbiased estimator that is more precise and that allows us to solve this problem. That is the generalized least squares estimator, which in principle is also relatively easy to obtain. In order to estimate our models, the data had to be weighted, which was done using analytic weights, which are inversely proportional to the variance of an observation. Of course, we had to choose a weighting factor, and we decided to use a geographical weighting. At the end, both the coefficient and the standard errors estimated by the GLS method are substantially different from those estimated by the ordinary least squares method. The effect of the population on the number of phone calls reporting cases of physical and psychological violence is positive, which was quite predictable considering that normally more people leads to more reports. There is also a negative effect of social confinement on the number of phone calls reporting that these two types of domestic violence. This indicates that during the confinement cases of domestic violence is likely decrease. The urban indicator has a significant effect too, but in this case positive, showing that urban census sectors report more cases of domestic violence. Another variable that has a significant and positive effect on the number of reported cases of psychological violence is the level of employment. Therefore, the greater the percentage of people with a job in the census sectors, the greater the number of complaints that are made. Surely, this reflects the greater capacity of reaction that people have when they are in a more stable economic situation and do not depend too much on their partners. Similarly, this could be explained by the cultural aspect in relation to gender issues. A sector with a higher level of employment means that it has more women working and therefore empowered to make the decision to report to the authorities when they suffer this type of abuse. Finally, the average years of schooling have a negative effect on the number of phone calls, reflecting that those sectors that are more educated are less likely to suffer domestic violence in their households. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our team in Quito. So I think what that demonstrates to us is what we can do if we have a rich data source. We can do careful analysis by looking at these data. We'll have to understand the underlying statistical approaches for this, and that this will be a new avenue for being able to really tease out some of the details of what we've just experienced from the pandemic and how we might be able to develop policies for potential solutions to these. So with that, thank you to all our teams who created these videos for this session. I'm going to turn now to our keynote address for the morning. I'd like to introduce Dr. Julie Gamble. Julie Gamble is an assistant professor at urban studies at Trinity College. She's an assistant professor of social science at the Universidad San Francisco de Quito. Julie's research focuses on alternative urban mobilities like cycling and informal transit in Latin American cities, and more broadly, the critical role of sustainable mobility policy in urban transformations across the global South. I think this will be an exciting presentation. Julie's title to her talk is Cycling for the Future Feminist City. And with that, Julie, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much, Melinda, for that generous introduction. I'm going to share my screen very quickly. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, wonderful.
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. Alrighty, so good morning, everyone. Thank you to the C2M2 network for the invitation and all of the conference organizers. So today my talk, I'm basically going to structure it around three main subjects, sort of my research background and how I have mainly moved from studying cycling under different circumstances to today, studying it under COVID-19 in particular. I'll bring out the challenges of ways of studying gendered cycling in this particular moment. And I will discuss very briefly the politics and the challenges of mobility and immobility, given that Carlos and his research team has given a very thorough discussion on domestic violence. I will go quickly through that. And then finally, what I'll do is talk about some of my data that I've been collecting and working with on and on over on and off over the last year as it relates to cycling. And if I have a little bit of time, I'll talk some about my research on informal transit. So again, I am interested in cycling and alternative mobilities. I study Quito. It's a city that is not necessarily, it's 2,800 meters above sea level. The population is about 2.5 to 3 million people, and it is nestled in the Andean mountain range. And so it is a mountainous urban landscape. So when you think about cycling, that is not necessarily the first mode of transport that you would think of when trying to move around. The city has 3 main bus rapid transit lines that run from north to south. The city is longitudinal, and it also has an emerging underground metro rail that will hopefully connect the city from north to south. That should be open in the next year. Along with this, it has an extensive public bus network that is mainly run by private transportation companies. Just to give you a little bit of information about some of the transportation trends, what you can notice here is about 70% of the population travels by public transit and 30% of the city travels by automobile. If you look at gender disparities in travel, just highlighting a couple of different categories, women are still facing, or based on 2017 data that we have, women are, their purposes are still mainly in personal, education, and work, whereas men's have slightly less percentages when you look at personal travel by public transport. If you look at data that we have with private vehicle, overall, what we know is if you do have that 30% of the population that does transport by car, there are more male drivers than female drivers, and overall, more women do not own a private vehicle. If you look at transit modal splits by gender, looking at public transport offerings, you basically see overall representation that more women are using public transport than men. And so I highlight this particular category of cycling because I am an ethnographer and I'm an urban planner. I am interested, and I start my research approach from a feminist standpoint, where I'm interested in uncovering the ways in which marginal actors create and construct knowledge in the social world. So I am interested in cycling and understand it as a marginal mobility actor. And within that small percentage of cyclists that consider that they move around by bicycle daily, an even smaller percentage of that is women. So back in 2012, 2013, when I was originally doing some of my doctoral research, I started by conducting ethnographic field work with urban cyclists in Quito. So I define urban cyclists as individuals who move around daily on bicycle, who I met through different urban cycling collectives, and who are overall involved in what you would call progressive activism, involved in trying to promote cycling in Quito as a mode of transportation. Another thing to notice during this particular moment is that I was studying Quito in 2012, 2013, where they were beginning to build an underground metro rail. They had just rolled out new bicycle lanes, and most importantly, they had installed a new public bike share program. So I was interested in understanding the more of the experiential, the ways in which some cyclists who were participating in trying to plan and help construct these bike lanes and getting their perspectives in the planning perspective. What ended up happening was I discovered very quickly by following these actors that they felt very unheard by the municipality. So what I wanted to do is just sort of try to tease out this discrepancy of, sort of planned versus lived infrastructures. So if you look on the image on the left, this is of their the main cycling routes and and the bike stations that existed in 2012, 2013. Through using mobility studies methods, I collected over a period of 2 months photo diary journals from urban cyclists. I distributed 75, I got back about 30. And what these photo diaries did was I had them tease out their ideas and what they were experiencing when they were writing. I had them do cognitive maps and take photographs. And so basically what I ended up doing was sort of remapping all the circulations based off of the travel diaries that I received back. This method combines in giving at that time with the data that or the type of technology that I had, I used disposable cameras. And to give you an example of what the diary would look like in the left hand, so they would, just kind of journal about their experiences when they were moving and give me sort of a small cognitive map. So through that, I did collect a number of different photographs, obviously, and I was interested at the time in just seeing, the visual expressions or the visual representations of the different affective and sensorial dimensions that don't necessarily come out when we think about the cartographic representation of a map. So what you see here are 3 different images. The first was our cyclists using a BRT lane because they feel safer from automobile traffic. Another image here is of a police car, which sort of didn't, to me at the time, just demonstrated sort of the conflictive relationship that they had with the police. And then the third image is really just of this way in which I received a lot of different photographs of individuals who were complaining about the cycling lanes or the lack thereof, and how they had to navigate an insecure and abandoned streets in order to get around. So really just like the material sort of spoke to me. So here I had at the end of this sort of just this collection of subcultural understanding of moving around in Quito. So that's just a little bit of my background and sort of how I started in engaging in this world and cycling infrastructure in Quito. So now today, if we flip and think about the times that we're living under, in Quito, we know that we have right now is a period of time when the city is starting to open up. So this is, but what we do know is that we have, like many other cities around the world, packed public transit. We have long commute times. We have long wait times. We have that has only been exacerbated at a time when public transportation for public health and safety reasons has dramatically been reduced over the last year. So for a city that 70% of its population relies on public transit to get around, you're talking about some definitive second order impacts that need to be explored in a lot more depth. At the same time, what we've known for a long time within transit studies and in general, since about 2014, the city actually conducted its first insecurity perception survey on what were the experiences of sexual assault and abuse on public transport. So this was dedicated to one particular BRT line called the trolley bus. As a result of obviously heightened reporting of a fear of sexual assault and high levels of having been reported as inappropriately being touched, what the city did was construct or they crafted a program called Reduce the Assault in order to have a municipal program that could deal with these kinds of violences on public transit. So what the program has overall been able to demonstrate since 2016 is basically that this program has helped increase perceptions of safety. And so, however, despite this, we know that women still continue to face sexual assault and violence on public transit, not just in Quito, but this is a phenomena that goes underreported and invisible on commutes around the world. So what this sort of does for me is set up what we know about cities in general is that whether we're talking about urban mobility or phases of quarantine, women are not necessarily safe in public spaces or private spaces of the city. So I'm not going to go on too long about this particular slide because Carlos and his excellent research does a much better job of setting up all of the different dynamics of increased emergency phone calls due to intra-family violence and psychological violence, increased levels of femicide happening around the country, and also continued reliance of where women are reporting doing more household work than men. The only thing that I would add to this is that we know that basically around 50% of Ecuador's employment offerings is within the informal sector. So you're talking about an increased unemployment and labor precarity underneath COVID-19. So under this, why have I chosen to study cycling? At a time last spring, at the height of the pandemic and the quarantine in Quito, the city responded by deciding at a time when they were reducing, or if not completely removing, public transit options for a large percentage of the urban population in order to hopefully have them to stay at home due to quarantine. The reality is a lot of Quito's population lives day to day, meaning that they need to get out in order to be able to eat and work in some sort of a way. So one response was that the municipality outlined a new program, outlined and basically rolled out about 70 kilometers of new bike lanes across the city. This was done through a consultation process with urban cyclists who have been moving around the city for a long time, and a lot of the same actors that I have been following over roughly almost the last decade. So what some of the survey data that came out immediately after the release of these new bike lanes is that there was a very large increase. We were talking of a 30,000 daily users to 196,000 daily users that was reported by June 2020. So you're talking about individuals who, and lots of new alternative mobility actors emerging. So not just an increase in cyclists, but also around the city you see scooters, you see electric bikes, you also see a larger presence of motorcycles. So within this, over the last decade, what I have done, as I sort of mentioned, I'm interested and start from trying to understand the presence of marginal mobility actors within a urban landscape. So have been following and am a member of the cycling collective that is all women called Carishina and Bici. This translates roughly from Quechua as bad housewives that cycle. So to me, this group represents double marginal mobility actors because they are women who cycle. These women are a group of mestiza women of mixed age and social economic status. In general, what this collective does is they represent women's interests when it comes to different mobility advocacy and working with public policy generated through the municipality. They do different activist events. They promote safe mobility options through different cycling schools targeted at women, but also more generally now to individuals interested in cycling. At the same time as the rollout of these bicycle lanes, Carishina and BC noticed and started drawing attention to all of these alternative mobility actors that were, taking advantage of the new spaces that they had on the street due to, or thanks to the municipality bolstering cycling by constructing new bike lanes. But at the same time, what they began to discover was that it was becoming an aggressive place. It wasn't necessarily feeling that safe to move around because lots of cyclists were not necessarily used to urban cycling, which is paying attention to street signs, paying attention to traffic, paying attention to the other individuals around in order to have everyone collectively moving around safely. So what they did was roll out different campaigns to try to soften the culture, to create a culture of care and gentleness. So within this, one of the main questions that I was asked to talk about today was how my research has changed underneath the pandemic. So I'm an ethnographer, so I believe in trying to understand a particular element of the social world around me, and this is trying to understand what's happening for cyclists at a particular juncture when cycling is being celebrated and seen as a positive mobility element within the city to move around. So what I did was I followed around 10 different women. So I moved to digital ethnography at this point because I was still in the US. And I asked 10 different women to basically provide me photo diary journals through WhatsApp. I had them take photographs of their travel journeys or their daily outings over the course of a month. I asked them to provide me details that sort of captured what they were feeling, where they were going, what they were doing. I also simultaneously asked them to participate in a WhatsApp focus group where they were given different themes around ideas like liberty and fear and what the pandemic means. And what I've actually been doing over the past several weeks with my time here in Quito is following up and going with them on GoPro ride-alongs in order to try to actually sort of spatially locate and get a better sense of the affective and sensorial dimensions of the experiences that they documented underneath the pandemic and just as quarantines were starting to be lifted in Quito. And along with this, I obviously was doing interviewing while I was cycling with them, and I followed up and did an interview after the cycling experience with them. So to just run through very quickly, this is sort of what one diary would look like. You know, this particular day, this participant is waking up. She didn't have that much energy. She then commutes to her work. She didn't actually take any photographs of her cycling experiences, but she felt that, you know, her energy had just changed so much that this was something that she wanted to capture this particular week once she had arrived at work. Other elements that she ended up taking photographs of were some of the new bike lanes. You know, it was really hard to get them to try to, you know, take pictures at particular times of day, just given COVID and the flexibility of work. It was hard to try to regulate or think about. And some of these cyclists were also unemployed. So it wasn't exactly like a daily work commute that I could necessarily follow. Different images that, you know, this particular participant is showing. On the one hand, the positive ways in which bike lanes now have different elements that help separate traffic a little bit better, but she also, you know, highlights the role of informal vendors that have really become a larger part of the streetscape. She also highlights what COVID has done in Quito, which talking about the different migrants that have emerged in the city with the immigration crisis that all of Latin America is facing. Different park spaces she felt very insecure going through just because of the different biosecurity measures that may or may not be happening within these what are mainly abandoned urban spaces that are being camped in by homeless people. Or other images that she took were just of the positive experiences that she had with the new bike lanes that were being that had been constructed, but then obviously there's also, you know, road work still happening. She notices the absence of vehicles. So basically what I did over with all of these 10 different cyclists was just to get a sense of the spatial pattern of where all of these were. I threw them into Google Maps just to get a sense of, well, are these located along the bike lanes? What can we actually know about them? But what I ended up going through all of the images and looking at the details is discovered that really what they're talking about are perceptions of security and insecurity. Once I was able to code the photographs. Right now, I've been working with a geographer and we've been creating a story map just that sort of highlights how these different individuals have constructed either not just, argue of bike lanes, but what it's been like navigating a city that's already defined by insecurity, that is mainly, its main feature over the past year has been abandonment and emptiness. And so with that, here, I'll just kind of quickly go through these. These are some maps that we've been working on. The white lines in this map represent the current bike lanes. The different numbers are of all of the different photos that sort of have been aggregated and populated and put onto the map. So here, this is a result of a GoPro ride along that I just did. So the advantage of the GoPro is that we can get GPS renderings to see where the actual this particular participant was going. What we know is that this participant was using the constructed bike lanes, and all of her photographs actually sort of were completely interpreted and can be understood as elements where she felt secure and insecure on the travel journey. A different cyclist that I'll highlight here, her route is in orange. She goes all the way to the south pretty habitually, which is an area of the city that was, before the pandemic, didn't have very many bike lanes, and now actually has a lot of bike lanes. She sort of talks about her experience moving around with a face mask. Here, you can, within the story maps themselves, it's a little bit harder to get a sense of. Here I have also uploaded the GoPro videos that just gives you a sense of what it's like to be moving in a city that's getting more traffic back every day. But it also aligns with a lot of the different perceptions that they had about the materials sort of that blocked, the things that were positive about the bike lane design, things that were not necessarily the best, how automobile culture and other mobility actors, I mean, you can see just here a person in a wheelchair using the bike lane. So these are the kinds of things that they would detail, but it became another way of sort of measuring and seeing and collecting data that kind of helped verify some of the images that they were also reporting back with. So what we also did, and what we're kind of and what we've been working with right now, is based off the fact that I've coded these coded the diaries and also the images according to security and insecurity that they feel on the that they experience on the travel route, or that they have perceptions of, is just, you know, we're actually just throwing it up against different kinds of urban indicators that talk about traffic accidentality, that talk about reports of theft and abuse. So what we've begun to see is that there is some correlation that you can say between areas that they have taken photographs of that have perceptions, that where they have perceptions of this category of insecurity that's also matched with, you know, things like traffic accidentality. So this is sort of the emergent work that we are working with. But I do think that it's telling that just because we have these bike lanes doesn't mean that we are still necessarily dealing with some of the insecurities that are riddled within the urban landscape that that individuals experience on a day-to-day basis. So overall, a lot of the different results that I've been getting are actually pretty similar to other moments that I've been studying what women do in order to protect themselves while on the move. And a lot of it is within cycling, but a lot of it is in public transit and also in informal transit, but just getting an understanding of, with more infrastructure, there are perceptions of increased safety, but women in general do have more subjective understandings of, or my informants reported more subjective understandings of that. So in order to make them feel secure, it becomes an individual sort of protective or coping strategies of how to move around. And so that's how they sort of identify different aspects of the urban landscape of, they continue to travel together, they continue to plan out the routes in order to feel safe so they know where they're going. Different actors use protective gear. I have one cyclist that was talking about the importance of her her lock that she has, then she always carries it in her back pocket as a way of feeling safe. There is greater perceptions of fear of travel at night. But what all of this does is it began to show me that what we know within transit studies literature is that their trips have become shorter. They have been focusing in on staying in their neighborhoods. And so this aligns with gendered travel patterns, which women tend to take more complicated trip chains because of care responsibilities. They make shorter and more frequent trips at the neighborhood level. And also women tend to try to work closer to home, of course, probably associated with care responsibilities. So overall, some of this data that we've been uncovering, on the one hand, it's really explicative of, I think that bike lanes do represent and are a positive way if we can get people out on the, if we can get more people out on the streets and creating more bicycle traffic, that's a great thing. But we also have to, and I think that promoting and increasing bike lanes is definitely the right way to do this, but also understanding that the urban landscape itself is riddled with perceptions of security and insecurity, and those spaces are for women overall still unsafe, no matter which way you want to look at it based off of statistics. So overall, I hope that I have been able to share with you today how courageous women are figuring out how to navigate a city that's still defined by insecurity and through COVID has been categorized as empty and abandoned. Okay, so I was told that I could talk for 30 minutes. And so I've been doing other alternative mobility work for the past couple of years. So I'm just gonna drop in a couple of lines to show you how I have been using other mobilities methods. I've been working with informal transit companies. So informal transit is basically informal labor that that works in the industries of collective taxis and collective vans that basically operate, I would say, in the holes of transit where there's low access or low frequency in the city. This is a pretty common phenomena in cities in the global South in general. So what I did with a research collaborator, Elisa Puga, was we got to know, spending about 6 to 8 months in the field, about 40 different companies. We interviewed them. About 30 of them gave us the opportunity to collaborate and do mapping with them. We gave them GPS devices to understand where they move. After that, we also conducted a survey to just figure out why transit users prefer this particular kind of service. What we discovered was that this is a very masculine industry. So it's the main service providers tend to be women, tend to be men. They are men who are underemployed in neighborhoods. So the providers themselves usually work in the neighborhood and are from the neighborhood, and individuals that ride these particular forms of transit are neighborhood dwellers themselves. Perceptions of safety came up. A lot of literature in different cities in Latin America in particular, I'm thinking of some case studies in Colombia, show that informal transit is not necessarily a safe option, but our survey came back showing that a lot of individuals tend to take these kinds of transportation because they feel more safe. We conducted different mappings at around neighborhoods. We discovered again, just sort of this trend of they really try to stick to the neighborhood. A part of this project, we ended up following 4 different women that moved from a low income area to a high income area where they work in the service industry to sort of tease out what maybe the survey data isn't telling us, where we began to discover the ways in which women use protective strategies of moving around, and in general, these 4 women felt and experience lots of different kinds. Overall, just talking about sort of the data itself, taxi route data shows us that there are long and short trajectories, but the average trajectory was about 6 kilometers. So that shows that we're still staying pretty much at a neighborhood level. We kind of did an understanding of testing origin and destination points to understand that travel patterns are showing informal transit operators work from low-income areas and providing transit to high-income areas. We're working this idea of centralities right now that sort of shows that origin points go to destination points. Destination points are areas defined by high population, mixed land use, and lots of different social cultural services like hospitals, education centers, child care centers. So the different colors are basically a sectorization of the city. Finally, underneath the pandemic, I was able to work with a team to get about 30 different interviews done. We called up all the different companies that we'd been working with. About 30 agreed to participate. We know that the occupation, most of the companies are still there. They are still working despite the pandemic. It continues to be a highly masculine industry. They have reported lower wages of below $430 per month. So that is much less than they were earning prior to the pandemic. We asked them also questions about if they stopped working to help with domestic care and child care at work, or assume responsibilities at work at home. Many of the masculine workers reported no, they didn't really do that. So I think that sort of represents some data that know about like at a much smaller scale that women are still probably taking on more care work at home and men are not necessarily doing that. And then finally, we wanted to find out a little bit more about what they were actually doing to try to help protect themselves and also help protect their passengers to make it a safe option. What we discovered is that they are basically doing all this the similar things that public transportation companies are doing. So I've run a little bit over, but I just wanted to give you a sense of all of the different ways in which I've been working with alternative mobility actors, that the transportation industry is definitely a highly gendered place. I would like to thank Trinity College, Universidad San Francisco, and the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy for making this research possible, Carishina and BC, my informants, informal transit companies, and in particular Quito residents, my research team. All of this is not possible, being able to gather ethnographic qualitative data in order to try to make sense of socio-spatial patterns. And finally, thank you so much to the C2M2 network and the conference organizers. It's been an honor to share my work here with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie, for such a fascinating and interesting topic area. This is important to bring these kinds of perspectives and viewpoints and research to the fore so that people can know all the various things that are going on to address with respect to the pandemic and this very unique topic area that I think would have lots of resonance all around the world in terms of places that have high cyclists, high numbers of cyclists. I think this would have a lot of lessons learned for those different areas. We're open now for questions and for comments from the audience. And I'm actually going to start off with a question from Ahmed that he put this here quite a while ago when we were still with the panelists. I think this speaks to your presentation as well, Julie. So I'm going to pose this question to you, which is, how does politics of inclusion and exclusion pan out in your research study areas in the wake of the pandemic?
Certainly. So, I mean, I think if I were to talk about a politics of inclusion in terms of the ways in which, so another way and the reason why I am interested in female cyclists is because in general, so the city itself has a pretty large participatory governance system. So it has a way of, and I've been studying since 2012 participatory meetings and trying to get a better understanding of how individuals participate in the decision making of well, if I'm a cyclist and I'm interested, I should go to the participatory meeting in order to try to make better, to influence the actual material outcomes, right? So there are lots of different participatory mechanisms in Quito. I found myself that those places were sort of Habermasian communicative rationale. They didn't necessarily represent a lot of different actors. Women weren't showing up. I mean, I study mainly middle-class people, right? So urban cyclists that are actually showing up at these kinds of events are not necessarily representative of peripheral low-income actors. Like there are cyclists who, or tricyclists that are using bike lanes right now who are selling snow cones, who sell popsicles, you see, or just street food vendors in general, people that move around because they on bicycle because they're bread makers. So low income populations don't necessarily get included in this, and I would not make the argument that my research in many ways represents those kinds of populations either. So it's what I'm looking at is pretty strongly middle class urban cyclists. And so I would say that that is, a limitation of my research for sure. I would say that these participatory moments weren't necessarily places where I felt that it was more of a communication from the municipality of what was going to be done, as opposed to a real sense of inclusion, which it happens a lot in the politics of citizen participation. And so I would say that there are those participatory mechanisms, but I found it much more easy and understand to look at the politics of inclusion through how people appropriate the street. In order to, in other words, express ideas of like right to the city. So my entry point into thinking about inclusion starts from how do people engage with the street, who's on the street, and also obviously within the context of trying to, if I can make the city more friendly for women to move around by bicycle, then if we sort of think about this in terms of magnitude and vulnerable actors, then hopefully we can begin to make the streets more safe for others.
Thank you for that, Julie. Quickly, I'm going to ask Matthew, because I see he's still on, and see if he wanted to address this issue of inclusion and exclusion from the perspective of his research topic. I don't know if I've caught him out, or Matthew, are you still there?
I'm here, sorry.
Yeah, okay. Did you catch that question? Just thinking about this issue of inclusion and exclusion in the political landscape and how that might be affecting your research activity.
I would just have to repeat what I said earlier about policies being gender sensitive. So there's a lot of, the literature talks about, I focus on rural areas. So one of the policies is gender sensitive land titling, sorry, I'm here with my baby.
Okay.
Gender sensitive land titling policies, which would help women access land, access programs and policies that allow them to get access to programs that were implemented during the pandemic.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, I love that, how perfect to hear our baby in the background. The other question I have, this is back to you, Julie. What about girls? Were you able to talk to younger girls at all and get a sense of how they might be engaged in this, if they're getting more involved in cycling because they see it as an opportunity? The shutdown maybe provided that. I don't know, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, again, so when all of this stuff happened, what I did was rely on my informants that I've been working with over the last decade. So I would definitely say I have not had an interaction with girls, but what I can say is that the collective that I do work with has been promoting, and in particular, education programs that are targeted at girls. So about, I guess in 2000, I think 2019, April 2019, the World Urban Cycling Forum occurred in Quito. And a very strong component of that was trying to empower young girls to get out on the bicycle. Another thing, so that in general, in terms of just sort of programmatic activities that are happening in Quito. On the other hand, what you do know, so another element that happened underneath COVID, and I was just trying to get at the senses of security and insecurity that these cyclists were reporting on within my talk, but more specifically as it was related to COVID, they did talk a lot about different like street enclosures, and these were specific street spaces that got cut off in order, so you sort of created like more like pedestrian public space zones in order for people to get out and move around a little bit because everybody was in quarantine and didn't really have a place to move around in. So the municipality did do this. And so all of my research informants actually did sort of talk about how they saw a lot of little kids getting on bicycles and participating in these kinds of moments. The other thing that the city does have is what a lot of Latin American cities have, which is the concept of like a Sunday street, which is a long corridor that it basically is blocked off to automobile traffic on Sundays. And what the city did was actually extend the hours in order to hopefully bolster people's use of those public spaces, which is the street, in order to try to make more spaces for people to get out in during the quarantine. And what I do have is a lot of images of little kids out on the street with their bicycles and with their families. That also poses other challenges to, like these conflicts within all of these different alternative mobility actors of, people wanting to race through the Sunday street, of people wanting to mainly make it more of a family event. So, I mean, you did get a sense of that, but I don't have like very strong data that would suggest that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Julie, for such a fascinating presentation. Thanks for doing our third keynote for the session. With that, I'm going to just have some wrap-up comments and talk about our next steps for the next day. Dongwon, if we could go to the next slide. First of all, I hope to see everyone tomorrow again. It would be great to see you. We have more of a workshop environment prepared for you and a different sort of day. Please, as you leave, please make sure you go to the post-event survey and let us know what you thought of the symposium. Some comments to share with you. Again, thank you so much to all the symposium participants. Thanks for all of you who came today to or have been here all 3 days. We so appreciate your participation. I wish so much we could have done this face-to-face and had more interactive dialogues. That would have been really nice. But also, thank you to all the panelists throughout the 3 days, a fascinating set of discussions that we've had. Thank you to the keynotes, and then thank you to all the C2M2 partners for their rich videos that they put together to talk about their programs and their projects. Thank you especially to all the hub leads, and all the support people from AAG and at Department of State, and then the particularly Dongwon and Wendy. And a shout out to Laura for overseeing a lot of this and helping with so much of this direction of the C2M2 program. So just a couple of comments here. The C2M2 Symposium was really to address the issues associated with vulnerable populations in an urban environment primarily, and focusing on these second order impacts. And these were loosely organized around gender, livelihoods, and mobility, migration across these 3 days. We really were trying to emphasize the role of a geospatial lens in understanding how we can tease out the details of these very complex and complicated issues, and recognizing that there's so much overlap and intersection amongst all of them. So it's very difficult to just say we're going to talk about gender and not get into a whole suite of other issues, as was exemplified by Julie's remarkable presentation. I think the other key thing to consider from the symposium is that this is a story of geography. This is about places, This is about understanding the context and the variability across space and time, identifying also the fact that there's so many common issues that we can talk about that are also exemplified across multi-scales and these multifaceted stories that we're starting to share. So it means that we have to question our underlying assumptions and identify new approaches. That's I think a key thing we've learned from this pandemic. And what are these sort of multiple avenues that we can begin to explore? So first of all, I think kudos to the power of the virtual environment. I know we've all been Zoom fatigued and all of these kinds of things, but it has been a powerful mechanism for maintaining communication and doing new and different things and communicating in new and different ways. I love the term that Julie used, digital ethnography, having to really think about how we can use this digital environment to do things that we normally did face to face. Another key thing is the ability to share a common language. Yes, the language of the symposium has been English, but so many of you are different language speakers, and we have been able to communicate using subtitles and using, again, the abilities that the virtual environment provides for us. And so I so appreciate us being able to come together and share this in a common language. The challenge we have for collecting new and different types of data and analyzing them in new and different ways, and how we collect them to be very careful with respect to people's privacy and anonymity is also a critical piece of this. And finally, to be really thinking about this urban landscape in a new and different way, the fact that our urban landscape has gone under a change. Julie mentioned this idea of spaces of abandonment, but then Fiquinata yesterday in the panel mentioned therapeutic landscapes and how we can identify those public spaces that provide those places for sharing and going to, and being able to really understanding the changing infrastructure needs. Where do we close roads and keep them closed? How do we change the urban environment to be more people-friendly across not only cyclists, but walkers, but all types of people who are there? So with that, I think we have the context for dialogues for collaboration, for next steps, and thinking where this might lead us. So I thank you all so much for participating. Please join us tomorrow. Please share your contact information so we can continue the dialogue, and please take part in the post survey. And with that, I'll close the symposium for today. Thank you very much.